I've said it before and I'll say it again. Atmosphere is often my number one. I'll admit that I can sit through a subpar story as long as the atmosphere keeps me invested in the world. I'm not calling Armitage a subpar story. That's for you to decide on your own. Because I like what I like, and I like the world that Armitage takes place in. It keeps my eyes fixed on the screen, and despite the flaws in the story, I still enjoy it. While there's not a whole lot I can find out about the development on this, I can find that the manga was written as an adaptation, much like with Angel Cop. Except in the case of Angel Cop, it was a merging of two different worlds, one of TV executives who were already working with famous directors and writers, slightly hijacking the idea of a mangaka and blending it with an existing proposal, then asking him to write a manga about this TV series that is currently in development hell. In the case of Armitage, the manga was contracted to a couple of mangakas in order to drive up hype for the release of the OVA. Zare Otana was the writer, who I can find no works for other than Armitage and a cancelled series called Happy Baseball, and then there's an illustrator named Tatsuya Ikegami, also known as Ryuya Ikegami. This guy only has some Steins Gate parodies and things like Welcome to the Pleasure Development Department, Child Making Research Department, and Let's Play with Sister. I think you get the picture. And this is a shame to me because when this illustrator isn't drawing pornography, some of the future city architecture detailing really reminds me of works from Tsutomu Nihei, the creator of Blom, though obviously not nearly as consistent, and let's understand that people like Nihei and Katsuhiro Otomo are absolute masochists when it comes to the consistency of their architectural detailing. Now, I see he's only drawn porn, but Ikegami's story doesn't actually end with hentai. In 2019, an indie game developer known as Nakidai hired Ikegami to create art for the manga adaptation of his now hit game, Your Turn to Die, which some people would compare to Danganronpa. This long-winded spiel to really just tell you that this manga was a contracted adaptation of the script for the Armitage OVA, written by Chiaki Konaka. Now, if you don't know that name, he was only one of the biggest screenplay and script writers for the greatest anime of the 90s and early 2000s. We're talking Big O, Bubblegum Crisis 2040, Digimon Tamers, Parasite Dolls, Technolize, Vampire Princess Miyu, that one anime, Narutaru, also known as Shadow Star, that takes a serious left turn from happy and bright to brutal very fast, and it's also like that in the manga. Oh yeah, and he also had this little small story you may have heard of called Serial Experiments Lane. This man has some of my favorites under his belt, and the thing is, most of the other people involved with this have good careers, but none were really at the head of other stories. For example, the director Hiroyuki Ochi didn't really direct anything else except Soul Bianca the Legacy, though he was an animation director and head of animation on many other projects before and after. Additionally, the original concept for Armitage III is credited to Ochi. Maybe he just didn't like directing. The first issue of the serialized manga released in January of 1995 in a magazine that went defunct 2 years later. That is, Monthly Shonen Captain, which is also kind of a shame because Monthly Shonen Captain was the home of many good properties. We're talking Guyver and Trigun at the very least. The first piece of the OVAs dropped in Japan in April of the same year. Both pieces of media released their final part in November of 1995. Pioneer immediately released the American subtitled version of the OVAs, and due to the hype of this being a hit at the time, Funimation funded a fully dubbed re-edit of the OVAs into a theater-release feature film in 1996 titled Polymatrix. However, that didn't actually see American theaters until 1997. And of course later we got the sequel movie Dual Matrix in 2002. The publishing and licensing of this has jumped around between being directly with Pioneer, one of their defunct subsidiaries, Geneon, and Funimation, which I believe is the final home, with the last release being a collection in 2012. You can find used DVDs and old VHS tapes for a fairly reasonable price on most of it, but it's also now available on Crunchyroll as of 2017. In the original English dub of Armitage, you get some of your well-knowns like Steve Blum, Dan Warren, Leah Sargent, Bryan Cranston. Yes, that Bryan Cranston. And if you didn't know, he did some anime voice acting in the 90s. And we're not talking anything big. I don't know, just Wings of Honiamise, Street Fighter II the movie, Technoman, also known as Tekkaman Blade, Mold Diver, Orgus O2, Macross Plus, and Eagle Riders. Now, if that last one does or does not sound familiar to you, it was the Americanized combining of Gatchaman II and Gatchaman F because Saban did stuff like that in the 90s. While Armitage can be criticized for its overindulgence in fan service, namely our main character being in little more than what can be described as combat lingerie for large portions of the OVAs, I say again, the atmosphere is gorgeous. The world pulls heavily from Cyberpunk, Blade Runner, and I would believe William Gibson's Neuromancer since Armitage is the name of a main character there. There is a distinct story, but Konaka really takes his time in the revelations about the history of the world, the characters, the events, and even at times seems to be kind of playing it by ear. But as we go through the two versions, the anime and the manga, they will start out very similar in story, but quickly diverge and never rejoin with each other. In tone, the anime has some dark comedy moments, but overall remaining serious for the most part. And the manga starts extremely goofy. And though it matures, there seems to be an effort to fill space for the sake of length. As I said previously, it never rejoins the story of the anime. Also, a big shout out to Jam and Scans, who translated this manga over 6 years ago. Go support guys like this, who like to do translations just for the fun of it. With all of that out of the way, if you're new, I'll basically be giving a sort of audiobook narration of the two pieces of media. Nothing but spoilers from here on out, and as with most, graphic content is abound. Fasten your seatbelts, we're taking off now. What I will describe as a space plane approaches its landing. On board, Detective Ross Syllabus wipes the fog from the window next to his seat. The pilot sits in a dark cockpit with holographic displays surrounded by robots operating controls, and walking down the aisle between seats is a female robot with no pants and the words, "Don't touch," written on one buttock. A voice chimes, telling the passengers of the current conditions outside, and it is revealed that the entire inside of the fuselage is a video screen which can perfectly show the outside world. So what window was Ross wiping the fog from? A woman complains about not working, wanting to relax, and about her guitar and the care that's being taken of it, while the man next to her tells her that she can't behave like she does on Earth. They have a concert schedule, and the guitar is being treated like a national treasure. The plane lands on what looks like a giant metallic quarter-pipe ramp and proceeds to shuttle itself to a docking station, which removes the fuselage from the top of the shuttle-like craft and slides it onto rails. It is now a train. As the doors of the cargo room spiral open, they reveal a man with short blonde hair and sunglasses carrying a guitar with one hand by the neck. He smashes it into a control panel and alarms begin to blare. The alarms alert the pilot and all the passengers. This plane train now begins to lose control, speeding down the rails. People are thrown to the ground by the forces, and the title of the first OVA appears, Electro Blood. Everything seems to have turned out okay, though, as the passengers safely disembark. Ross takes a look around and sees that there are a lot of people dressed as cowboys, holding signs for someone named McCannon. The blonde man walks past Ross, bumping into him briefly. He's escorted by 4 large men while he wheels a rather large suitcase towards the exit. However, the voice of Armitage rings out, telling him to freeze as she levels her pistol at him. Ross leans in close and asks what's up. She addresses him by name, telling him to get back. The blonde man tells his escorts to handle it, and Armitage smacks Ross in the face, telling him once again, get back. She fires a point-blank shot into the face of the first man, who only grunts as Armitage fires more shots into him. The blonde man and 2 of his escorts take off running, while 2 stay behind to fight, and a firefight ensues. Ross ducks for cover and asks the cowboys for guns, but none have one. As the blonde man runs, his suitcase leaks blood. Armitage tries to run after him, but is grabbed by the ankle by one of the men who stayed behind to fight and lifted into the air. Ross decks the man in the face, and he drops Armitage onto his shoulders. She leaps off, aims her gun, and welcomes Ross to the MPD as she fires. The shot strikes the suitcase, throwing the blonde man off balance and opening the suitcase. Out falls the woman from the plane, dead. She has a bullet wound to the head. The crowd recognizes her and begins rushing towards the body. The blonde man regains his footing, pulls out a submachine gun, and begins firing into the windows of the airplane terminal, causing glass to rain down. He then turns to jump out the windows. As he does, Armitage throws a pair of handcuffs and manages to snag one wrist. The man manages to make it to a convertible getaway car and Armitage leaps after him, landing on the trunk of that same car. The car speeds away, but Ross can only watch and yell. The terminal is a mess. People are crying and glass everywhere. Ross goes to inspect the body of the woman, and Armitage magically reappears to tell him that the name of the girl was Kelly McCannon, a country singer from Earth, the only country singer left. She introduces herself and begins to tease Ross, but he quickly throws her off, exclaiming that Kelly isn't even human, it's a robot. Armitage then changes her expression, grabs her sunglasses, and walks away, telling Ross that it's airport police's jurisdiction. Ross and Armitage arrive at the police station, and as Ross steps from the car, he is immediately accosted by the media asking questions about the murder. From the car, Armitage smiles and waves at him as she lets him take the heat. In the police station, all the officers are gathered and going over the murder. Kelly McCannon was neither a cyborg nor a human. She was a robot who had human tissues constructed through far more advanced means than the previous generation known as seconds. She was built illegally, and there are possibly more just like her. According to the passengers, the only suspicious person was Detective Syllabus. The police believe that maybe she was a replacement for the real Kelly McCannon, but something just doesn't sit right. Before Armitage introduces Ross to his new apartment, they walk through a corridor and Ross looks up to see the sky is entirely composed of hanging buildings, much like the geofront in Evangelion. As they walk into the apartment, they turn on the TV, which happens to be the entire window. The news seems to be paying tribute to McCannon, and it is shown on all screens across the city, but they switch to a video sent in by the killer. The killer is seen walking in and immediately shooting Kelly before dragging her body to the middle of the aisle. He looks at the camera as Kelly begs for help. In another location, an artist pauses her work to watch the broadcast with concern. Broadcast shows the killer shoot Kelly point blank directly in the head. Keep in mind, once again, this is being seen all across the city. The video concludes, and Armitage leaves Ross standing alone in his apartment as the news continues showing an advocate for the separation of robots saying this is not what she wants. Ross has a flashback, injured and crying over the body of his former partner. A badly damaged robot emerges from behind a car, and Ross shoots it multiple times before waking up in a cold sweat. His video window shows a beautiful scene of nature as he rubs his leg. He decides to go out for a jog, which gives a view of just how massive this city on Mars is, and we see that the city has its very own Statue of Liberty. His jog takes him to the police station where a coworker, Eddie, who is played by Bryan Cranston in the dub, is sleeping on a couch in the locker room. He gives a few pieces of advice. Don't kill your partner this time, alluding to Ross's past. And also, when Armitage puts on her visor, watch out. He then sits up to toss Ross the key to his car that seems to have been transported from Earth and lays back down. Downstairs, the car is waiting for him, and another coworker, Chris, ogles over the car. It's a Ferrari. While it can be autopiloted, he chooses to drive it himself. Chris tries to hold a conversation, but Ross drives off. Down in the street, a protest is taking place. People believe the robots are taking their jobs, and they demand that they get out. Ross goes to visit one of the robot manufacturers to see if he can get any information about the murdered robot, which they are now calling a third. But the man only tells him that it wasn't one of theirs. It was obviously handmade, but it doesn't fall into the type that they make. They aim to integrate robots into the family, give them a purpose so that the humans and robots can live in harmony. Robots were used for labor and environmental testing when first settling Mars, and now they have come this far. The consumer may not understand their goals yet because they are afraid of robots and don't understand the potential. Ross gives the man a sideways look and departs. At another robot manufacturer, as Ross walks up the stairs, there are more protesters, and inside, Armitage is demanding the receptionist let her see someone named Asakura. Remember this name for later. But the receptionist says Asakura has never heard of her. Armitage displays her disrespect for the robot before Ross grabs her and carries her outside on his shoulder past the protesters and tosses her in the car. She asks what's next, and Ross suggests that they check immigration, to which she says she's already done it. It will be hard to find this guy since 37% of the population isn't registered. So he asks what she was doing. She tells him it's private. He tells her to stop flying solo since they're partners, and she gives him a smile as they drive off to the next destination. Food. Food, as it turns out for Armitage, is ice cream, which they enjoy while looking out over the massive expanse of the city lights. The scene reveals that there actually is a sky and they're not underground. She makes a remark that Ross seems to have something against robots, and he says that he doesn't like that they are machines that only copy humans. He doesn't want to associate with robots or cyborgs. Armitage seems taken aback by this, so she puts on her visor and walks off, leaving Ross standing there confused. The next day, they find Kelly's manager drunk at a bar. He rambles about the type of girl she was, before slamming his drink and saying he doesn't believe she could be a robot. He begins to cry before grabbing Armitage and pleading that she wasn't a robot. No robot could have had that passion she did, but Armitage throws him off of her onto the ground, coldly stating that she's dead and to get real. She leaves as Ross trails her, yelling after her in the parking lot. She doesn't feel bad for the guy not being able to believe that a robot could do that. That robot had all the hopes, dreams, and talent of Kelly McCannon in it. Ross begins to question, no, realize that Armitage may be. A call comes in, and Ross pulls out what someone in the 1990s definitely would have seen as the future of mobile phones and devices of the like, complete with wireless earpiece. It's really not too far off from modern smartphones. It's Chris, and he asks if Armitage is around, but she's disappeared. A voice message is being transmitted, and he's sending it to Ross's mailbox. A woman named Jessica Manning is in a panic. She's a third and needs to speak with Armitage. She's receiving a list of all the thirds from Pluto. She can't leave because of the protests, but she knows something is going to happen to her. As Ross drives to the scene, broadcasting all across the city and inside the car are more robots being executed by the killer at the scene, who now introduces himself as Rene Dan-Claude. Talks of robots disguising themselves as humans, the thirds. He has to kill them because they shouldn't be allowed to do that. His current target, Jessica Manning, the artist from earlier. Ross makes it to what looks like a small town outside the city and finds an art shop on the street with all the windows smashed. He clears the room and finds a woman crying in a corner. The woman clings to him and begs him to save Jessica. In the city, Ross breaks his way through a crowd to find that they are burning a giant pile of robots. Suddenly, Armitage is struck with a barrage of information. It's the list of thirds being transmitted wirelessly to her from one of the robots in the burning pile. This robot also transmits a farewell to the woman from the art shop. One of the burning robots is Jessica. As Ross wanders the streets, Dan-Claude swings and jingles the handcuff which Armitage threw at him in the beginning, using this to grab the attention of Ross, who draws his gun and chases after the man who is laughing maniacally as he runs away. And somewhere in the city, Armitage gazes at the burning pile, realizing she's too late to help. Ross follows Dan-Claude to a church, and as he enters, Dan-Claude jumps on his back from above, strangling him with the handcuffs. Ross drops his gun, and Dan-Claude taunts him about the death of his partner. He gets excitement from killing robots. The more they look human, the better. He lets Ross go, who struggles, crawling away between the church pews. Dan-Claude picks up his gun and begins to shoot as Ross finally begins to make it to his feet and run away. Ross then makes his way up a stairwell, and as he takes a moment to rest on the railing, it seems he was hit in the leg. But no time for that. Dan-Claude comes rushing at him and begins to strangle him once again with the handcuffs as he tries to push him over the railing. Ross manages to fight back and punch Dan-Claude a few times, knocking him through a door to the outside, where he proceeds to knee him until his knee is caught by Dan-Claude, and he rips a hole in the pants with his teeth, revealing Ross has a robotic leg, and pulling him to the ground. He taunts Ross while holding him down, but a church bell rings, stopping both men. Armitage rushes around, eventually revealing herself standing above them on I-beam framing. She hacks a crane next to her with a look and says she justifies the existence of thirds with her blood, as she is also a third. Dan-Claude denies this, as she wasn't on his list, but as the crane lowers onto the building they are standing on, Ross regains the advantage and continues the fight before the crane crashes down where they were. Armitage then rushes down the crane at high speeds, blocking shots from Dan Claude along the way, eventually jumping through an explosion to land on him, only to be stabbed in the collar. But she grabs him by the throat and electrocutes him. He falls to the ground and she removes his knife. She shakes his unconscious body as she yells at him that she is a monster. But what is he going to do? Blame them for the recession and social problems? If humans don't want them, then why did they make them? In her tears, she prepares for a final strike, but Ross calls for her to stop. Just cuff him. She's a police officer first. Bots aren't the enemy of humans, which means the opposite is also true. She drops her fist and cries. The two partners stand there for a moment. Armitage cries about not being human before jumping into the waters below. Ross dives in after her and drags her to shore. He thanks God when she wakes up, but this only sets her into a bad mood, and she leaves him behind. Episode 2. Flesh and Stone. A woman is running down a tunnel, but soon she is caught, and we see her tied up to the railing of a lift. She asks the captor what he wants, why she has to die. She's not alone. But before the last words go out, she is shot in the head, and the lift begins to move as she is shot repeatedly. Two workers are waiting at the top, and they discover her body, and as expected, she's a robot. At the MPD, they are reviewing the victim, 24-year-old Lavinia Whiteley, a dancer, who was also a third. The chief calls for the attention of Ross and asks him if Dan Claude is in Shinora, a police hospital, to which he responds affirmatively. He's unconscious in the ICU, meaning they can't question him, and the fact that he's in Shinora means he had an accomplice. To top it off, Armitage is missing. They wonder why all the thirds have been women, but Ross is distracted, thinking back on the crying words of Armitage in their last encounter. As the meeting continues, one of the officers reviews that all of the thirds have been manufactured illegally, and they are waiting for examination reports from a company called Conception. The chief calls to see Ross after the meeting, and in his office he informs him that Armitage chose to become a cop, but Ross is why she disappeared. Ross insists to be interrogated, but the chief says it's not necessary. He believes he doesn't know anything. However, he believes there is a definite connection between Armitage and the killing of the thirds. Ross visits Armitage's apartment to find her not there as rain comes down, and he sits on her bed and looks over to see a picture of a young Armitage with an old man. He decides to leave her a message detailing that the MPD suspects that she is a third. Dan Claude is suspected to still have an accomplice as thirds are currently being murdered. Isn't she angry? Armitage is in an alleyway listening to the message that signs off with, "Come back, okay?" With her trademark sunglasses and a full-body cloak, she walks down the alleyway, encountering two punks, one of which extends his cane in front of her to stop her and ask for money for beer. She glares at him, and the larger accomplice steps in front of her and pulls a knife. She asks if they know of anyone who writes novels around here, and the smaller man with the cane says he was once a writer of fine online porno, but nothing was ever published in paperback. The larger man cuts the top button of her cloak, and it falls to the ground, revealing the combat lingerie I referred to earlier. But then they see she is covered in scars. She chuckles and then punches the larger man in the stomach, and he drops. The smaller man takes off running, and Armitage chases after, eventually grabbing the man's legs and causing him to land face first and slide. She steps on his back and demands that he answer her questions, and he agrees. But he grabs his cane and flips it towards her. It extends a blade and stabs her in the shoulder. She smiles at this and asks if he's ready to answer her questions now. But he screams that she's a monster, and this makes her stop for a moment. Ross is talking on his vidphone with Eddie, who has set up an appointment for Ross with the head of Conception, another robot company. By the way, Armitage was communicating quite a bit before she disappeared. He found a log, but he can't tell what's on it yet, as it's in machine language. But he'll figure it out. He's good at this kind of thing. Ross is greeted at Conception by a robot resembling Usagi Tsukino, Sailor Moon for those of you who don't know. The robot leads him to the office of Alan, VP of Public Relations. Ross cuts to the chase as he sits down. He's here about the examination of the thirds they have requested. Alan says they're working on it. The architecture is different from that of their own robots. He motions for the Sailor Moon bot, who promptly takes a knee, and he takes a seat on the one not on the ground. This obviously strikes Ross strangely. Ross asks if androids could be constructed with organic fibers. It would be an attractive product for the company, right? But Alan retorts that it serves no purpose for them to simulate humans. Is Ross familiar with their motto? Ross responds, home robotization. It would be a way for them to corner the market. Alan says he sees what Ross is implying, that they are the ones manufacturing the thirds. But Ross says, well, he has one more thing. And he pulls his notebook from his pocket, but as he does so, he drops a lighter on the floor. He asks if an inventor named Asakura is on staff, but Alan says he can't remember. Ross insists that he is, and he would like to see him, but Alan now says, well, he quit before he joined the company several years ago. Ross stands to leave, and Alan tells him that he's welcome to check the company files. Ross then asks him if the Sailor Moon bot is an example of home robotization, to which Alan responds that part of it is fulfilling fantasies. Ross gives him a look as he responds, everything except the ability to reproduce, huh? And Alan seems to don a guilty look for a moment before saying something like that. Ross steps outside, escorted by the bot. He goes to light a cigarette, and then informs the bot that his lighter must be gone. As she goes upstairs to retrieve his lighter, he accesses a computer terminal and downloads the files. Ross accesses the files he copied in his car, but the data on Asakura is locked. He concludes that that kind of information must be hidden even from the VPs. At the murder scene of now the seventh third, Chris says that he can only think of two people who kill robots like this, Armitage and Dan Claude. Ross looks at him puzzled, and Chris elaborates that Armitage says she pities robots used for crime, so she kills them instantly. We see a flashback of the current dead third auto-dictating her novel at her desk. Soon, a guest enters. She asks if it's Armitage, the one who contacted her. Then she declares they fooled her, and then she is shot in the head. All of this is recorded on her computer. Armitage is now a suspect, but Ross isn't convinced. He asks the computer to bring up the logs of email and search for Armitage. Instead, there is a message from someone named Pluto, who is using Armitage's ID. Ross asks Chris to find where the mail came from. Eddie is hard at work in the office when he has an epiphany, and it seems he has cracked the code. On the screen, a woman appears stating, "Here is the list of thirds from Pluto." Eddie thinks that they mean the planet, but we now know that this is a person. Eddie yells for the chief that he cracked it, but the chief is having another conversation. They've discovered an ability of the thirds in their examination. The chief yells to go get Ross. As Ross is driving to where Chris traced the message, he receives a vid call from the chief talking about the file that Eddie cracked. But Ross already knows it's a list of thirds and Pluto is the last alive. The chief says there's one more thing. They discovered the reason the thirds are female. Lavinia Waitley was pregnant. The thirds can reproduce. A bunch of kids are heading into a school, and outside on a set of monkey bars, Armitage sits ominously as Ross shows up. She asks if Ross showed up to protect Pluto and drags Ross into the school with her where they find Pluto sitting on a piano. He's uploading his consciousness in case he's killed. This third is a boy. He takes them down a lift, and I can't help but noticing that this kid is wearing a Heer infantry officer visor from World War II. Anyways, he now asks not to be called Pluto, his handle, so Armitage calls him by his real name, Julian Moore. The lift suddenly stops, but then it begins to descend uncontrollably. Ross holds on to Julian, and Armitage grabs the rails behind them and positions herself as a restraint for them. The lift strikes the water below, and Ross has broken his right arm and some ribs. They don't have long to contemplate this, as suddenly a giant robot emerges from the waters. A clawed tentacle appendage swings at Armitage, but she dodges and shoots. It blocks the shots with a massive metal arm, and she tells the rest that they must run for it as she puts Ross's arm over her shoulder and drags him. They run down a tunnel and wind up at a dead end, blocked by a gate where water is falling into a pool below. She turns to run and fight the giant robot and manages to get on it, where she rips off a panel and shoves her cloak into an engine air intake. The sudden loss of power throws her off, and the robot scoops her up with a claw and begins to crush her. Ross tries to aim his gun, but he's injured. Julian steadies his arm and helps Ross take the shot, blasting the top off of the cockpit of the robot, revealing Dan Claude laughing maniacally. Armitage shoots at him, but the giant back wheel of the robot is swung around, knocking her into the gate over the waterfall. Dan Claude is quickly on her with the robot, but she punches him hard and concludes he's not human. Dan Claude powers up for the killing blow, but the CPU of the beast overheats and it shuts down. As Dan Claude tries to figure out what's happening, Armitage appears before him, smiling. She's handcuffed him to the cockpit. The robot breaks through the gate and plummets. Armitage then goes to leave with Julian, and Ross calls her cold. She runs back and kisses him and says she's always cold, and Ross loses consciousness. The last shot of the episode is Dan Claude resurfacing. He's not dead. Episode 3. Heartcore. A female robot walks into an airport. Her eyes begin to blink, and there is the distinct beeping of a bomb. She explodes. The sounds of news broadcasts discussing what they are referring to as the puppet bombings are being heard as we drift down the street and pick up with Armitage and Julian. Julian has just informed Armitage that the thirds can reproduce, except he is a boy and he wasn't equipped for that. Why was Julian made? His serial number indicates that he was the last off the line. He taunts Armitage about her maternal clock and that maybe she wants Ross, but Armitage swats him away. She just wants to know why the thirds were made. Ross is in the chief's office being caught up. He's despondent as the chief asks about his recovery. He finds it ironic that Ross is being made more robot by the day considering his hatred of them. After the last incident, he has more robotic body parts. He asks for his new orders as he doesn't believe he needs to look into the bombings, but the chief disagrees, and he commands that Ross look into it. He doesn't believe Ross's report of Dan Claude showing up at the scene and invites him to go see Dan Claude in the hospital for himself. However, when he gets to the hospital, a doctor informs him that he can't see Dan Claude. He decides to make a quip about how there's a high level of security, and surely there is. But as he is leaving, he sees the doctor walking back into the hospital, only to be greeted by Alan from Conception. The two interact as though they are friends, and this does not sit well with Ross. Armitage and Julian are breaking into a memory bank I.O. room. They are stopped by an armored security bot, which Armitage quickly dispatches. Once inside, Julian locates an I.O. panel, and in a seemingly painful process, he shoves a cable between his collarbones. He begins searching files and requests Armitage to bring up his navigational monitor, and as she does such, a holographic screen appears. Julian says he found a still image, and when it appears on the screen, Armitage is shocked to see Dan Claude standing with Asakura. Ross is driving when he receives a call from Chris telling him that the chief is looking for him. He starts to hang up, but Chris tells him to wait. They have a board from one of the puppet bombs, and it's identical to a board for the thirds. Ross smirks. Armitage is wrestling with the fact that Asakura is pictured with Dan Claude, but Julian has been made. Someone is taking over his body. He cries as he begins to strangle Armitage, who kicks him away. Dan Claude begins to taunt Armitage through Julian. She narrowly jumps away from a leaping punch. Alan is engaged in some activity where he's hooked up to cables connected to multiple female robots. I believe we can understand the implication. The cables are ripped out of his head, and as he falls to the floor, he looks up to see Ross, who surveys the room. Alan stands up to berate Ross, but is cut off mid-sentence by a punch. Ross lifts him up by the collar of his robe and begins interrogating him. The man in the hospital is the real Rene Dan Claude, creator of the Assassinroid. This means that the Dan Claude they have seen is a robot based on the character data of the real Dan Claude. While they converse, one of the robots on the ground opens its eyes. Julian, now fully possessed by Dan Claude, laughs maniacally as he taunts Armitage to pull the trigger. He says he's not a third and shouldn't be compared to them as they're failures. Armitage shoots the I/O panel and then smashes it, and we see that Dan Claude in his real body gets electrocuted in an apartment before catching fire. Armitage catches Julian as he collapses, but he pushes her away as he becomes engulfed in blue flames. Ross yells at Alan for more information before noticing the robot crawling on the ground behind him. Its eyes are flashing, so he runs and escapes as it explodes. Armitage screams as Julian finally explodes and dies. Ross recovers from the explosion, only to find his phone ringing. He answers, and it's Armitage, asking for help. The chief is visited by the head of legal affairs, and they are relaying that Ross is responsible for the death of Alan, but he wonders why accompanying this man is a female representative from Earth. He tells her that they should notice Mars is not a feminist society. More on that later, but the man simply says that they can call it here and get lunch. Ross stands on a cliff at a grave they have made, placing Julian's hat on the marker. He then walks over to Armitage, but as he reaches out to her, he gets a call. Instead of answering it, he throws his phone off of the cliff. He then walks over to her and gives her a bit of hope, reminding her that Julian made a backup of himself. She concludes that she's going to go see him, as he may have more info, and she asks Ross to come with her. Ross sits in a chair that's linking him into the system and begins to beam into his eyes, and he finds himself floating in cyberspace. Armitage flies to him and carries him to where Julian is. They summon the fallen third, and Armitage goes to rejoin him, but Ross is stuck in a force field. Julian makes a motion, and all of the murdered thirds begin to appear. Unfortunately, they lack sufficient data to be able to speak. They disappear, and Julian informs them that he has learned much, but Asakura's files have been erased. However, they should go find the real Dan Claude. Return now, or they may not be able to get back to their bodies. Eddie and Chris are looking at the hospital. It is loaded with security, including a multitude of tanks, but then they pick up on something on the map headed that way. A car. Then there's an explosion, and standing in the road are Armitage and Ross, ready for battle, and the battle commences. Armitage rushes to the front line and begins dismantling tanks and soldiers alike, while Ross fires grenades from the street, causing more destruction. As alarms blare, they run through the corridors of the hospital, pursued by more soldiers until Ross throws a grenade behind him. They blast down a wall, and they've arrived at the room. As the doors open, Dan Claude, the real Dan Claude, is found, hooked up to a support bed. He awakes and instantly recognizes Armitage, calling her Asakura's daughter, a failure. She disconnects the cables and IVs and grabs his body, but suddenly she says to wait. The robotic Dan Claude appears with his maniacal laugh, clad in a full suit of giant robotic armor. He begins to fire at the pair, and they scatter. Ross shoots a grenade, but it doesn't affect the robot, so they run. As they run, Armitage says there's no way that Dan Claude is a third, but the real Dan Claude she is carrying laughs and asks if she thought she was. They are brother and sister of the prototype, running the same CPU. She should ask Asakura at his dome in Danich Hill. With that, Armitage has the information she needs, and she drops Dan Claude to turn and fight the robot Dan Claude. She charges up and begins to glow as she charges him, and as the two meet, a massive explosion erupts from their collision. Episode 4. Bit of Love. Ross and Armitage ride away from the scene on a motorcycle, and we get a flashback. Armitage is injured. The real Dan Claude dies in the collateral damage, laughing and taunting her about his privilege of being human. Ross picks up Armitage, only to be taunted by more laughs, now from the robot Dan Claude, who is only a head hanging from the ceiling. But Armitage throws a piece of metal she was impaled with into his skull, and it explodes. The news shows us that Ross and Armitage are now fugitives from their activities, while Ross meets up with Eddie in a graveyard. Eddie has info for him about this Danich Hill. He hands him his phone and shows via a satellite surveillance photo that the place is blacked out on the map. Ross pockets the phone and tells Eddie it was lost in duty. Ross and Armitage are now driving down the highway. Armitage says she's not okay. Her CPU is messed up and she'll probably die soon. Ross is concerned for her and she asks why. He's a wanted man now because of her, and he's doing all of these things for her. Why is he hanging out with her? Ross loses his temper and tells her to stop. She's asking questions like a little kid, and he doesn't know why himself. But immediately after, they see the dome, and Ross swerves the car into a sliding halt. It's a conception laboratory. The two walk through dark corridors with guns drawn until eventually coming to a massive greenhouse. They call out for Asakura, but instead find a giant tree-like organic robot, and as they discuss it, Dan Claude appears. But he's different. Armitage points her gun at him, but he only asks if they would like to see Asakura, and he asks them to follow him. Asakura sits alone at a computer station. As Armitage excitedly calls out to him, addressing him as Papa, he's more interested in Ross, saying Conception finally delivered the parts he ordered ages ago. She continues to try to get his attention, but when he does acknowledge her, he only remarks that he didn't know there were any third prototypes still around. Her architecture is old. He then asks for them to come see his latest bioroid. He no longer wishes to copy humans. This is truly alive, and it's revealed that it is one of the tree-like robots. He happily exclaims that it can make Mars habitable for humans and animals, and eventually it can become a citizen. But Conception doesn't understand his work, and he goes into an angry tirade. Dan Claude informs them that Asakura's mind was altered. Please don't ask him about the past, as it may be painful. They ask who he is, and he introduces himself as Wilbur Dan Claude. Asakura cuts in to inform them that he was an assassin-roid developed by Renee, but he was way too smart, so Asakura dumbed him down. But Wilbur says he's joking. He actually upgraded him. Ross begins to ask questions, but Armitage says forget it. She wants to leave. That night, the two of them rest by a fire. Armitage is curled up next to a tree, and she says her CPU is frozen. She will die soon. Ross wonders if they can fix her, but she says Asakura having lost his sanity, she's going to die without knowing anything. There's no reason for her to be alive anymore. Ross comforts her with a smile and kind words, and she kisses him. He kisses her back, and they tenderly make love. After this, the news briefly informs us that Mars and Earth have signed a pact, including an economic aid agreement, and we are shown Earth's female president. In the morning, Ross and Armitage awake to Wilbur saying that he wants to show them something. He tells them that Asakura wants to terraform the planet with his new bioroids, but he doesn't think it's possible. As a large vat rises, he reveals that it was supposed to be the sister to Armitage. She's horrified, and she asks Ross not to look, but Ross asks if there's more. Wilbur tells him that the assassin-roids were the strongest, meant to infiltrate and live in society until their time was right. They were used as the outline for the thirds, but there was always an imperfection in the prototypes, especially in their minds. Armitage takes this to heart and concludes that she is defective and runs. Back in the greenhouse, Ross asks what the purpose of the thirds was. Why were they able to reproduce? Wilbur explains that the birth rate is extremely low on Mars, so the idea of a robot that could reproduce was extremely attractive to Conception. But then, why the assassinations? Earth's government is feminist, and a female robot that can reproduce goes against this concept. Mars and Earth plan to sign a pact, which we know is happening. Additionally, Wilbur admits that he and his brother share the belief that thirds are just copies of humans that should, Armitage cuts him off, be terminated? Why? She's been existing. Wilbur responds that self-preservation is in her programming. However, unlike his brothers, he would like to help her. At that moment, Ross's phone rings. He answers expecting Eddie, but instead, it's the chief. Eddie is on suspension for aiding a fugitive. Ross says he forced him, and the chief says he expected as much. However, Ross and Armitage are suspected of the puppet bombings. The army is coming to bomb the dome. The chief says he forced Eddie to tell him where they went, and requests that they turn themselves in, but Armitage plans to get Asakura out. She tries to convince him, but he's too stubborn. He still acts only with regards to his new creations, and they are not prepared for the outside. As she pleads with him, she knocks over a picture on the desk, revealing that it's a picture of the two of them together. She pulls a gun on him and tells him It's a police order that he evacuate. He smiles and calls her by name. She dives into his arms for a hug, and he tases her. He apologizes as he cradles her unconscious body, and he says he will fix her one last time. And as we fade out, he declares, "Now, you're real." The army rolls through the desert towards the facility, and Ross speeds away in an army truck with Armitage unconscious in the back. Asakura stands in his garden as the bomb drops, and Armitage watches from the back of the truck. They pull over, and Ross offers to smuggle her to Earth, but she says she will return to the city. She will not run away. Drones fly overhead and spot them, and she shoots one down. She declares this is where they part ways, and Ross doesn't have to hang out with her anymore. But he angrily declares that he wants her to live. He comforts her and says that if she goes back, he will always be with her. All across the city, the backups of the dead thirds can be seen taking over the televisions and broadcasting the army out in the desert. However, only the robots can see it. To everyone else, it's static. The army is lined up out in the desert. As Ross and Armitage stand at the edge of a canyon preparing for battle, Ross jumps into a large exosuit, and Armitage throws off her coat. They split up, and Armitage sprouts wings. As she flies around, she fires lasers, destroying soldiers, tanks, and helicopters. Dodging gunfire and rockets, she continues to rule the battlefield until one of her wings is cut off. Ross fares equally well in the exosuit until one of his arms is blasted off. They fight on, but the army is closing in, each of them taking more and more fire, until the last thing seen is one of Armitage's new wings in the sand. We fast forward several months, and at an airport we see what may be Ross, and underneath the painting Jessica Manning was working on at the beginning of the OVAs, Armitage with a slightly different haircut. Ross drives down the highway in a pink convertible, and he hands her a human ID card. She's an Earth citizen now, with a fake name, Annalisa Bradford. She lets go of it, and it flies away. Ross is stunned, but she says the name sucked anyways. As she relaxes, Ross asks if she wants to go see Julian, but she says not until they are 3. She's pregnant. I've always enjoyed this anime. I enjoyed Dual Matrix a little bit less, and I'm not sure why. The only thing that bothers me is how the hell did they survive? It really seems like they're going down. They're about to die. It sets it up that way, but nope. Alive and able to freely walk around. Oh well. I still love it. The animation, the scenery, character design, and story for all of its flaws. After all that, what kind of tale will we get from the manga? Well, keep in mind once again that this is not source material, rather a companion piece that was kind of intended to generate hype for the upcoming anime. The contents of this manga will diverge wildly, and we begin, in this case, as with most, with introductory text. At the end of the 22nd century, the development of Mars entered its migration stage. Mankind had been developing Mars. Although it was possible for humans to be able to survive on the planet in a little less than 100 years with an atmosphere synthesis operating at elementary particle level, most of the Martian workforce that arrived there to work during that 100 years period were robots. After that, robots on Mars worked on roads and water and sewer services, continuing to become an important part of its social infrastructure like a communications network. Before long, the robots of Mars became indistinguishable in appearance from humans, with some becoming even more beautiful than their human counterparts. However, the Earth Federation which governed Mars declared those who advanced the second generation, or seconds, to be ethically inappropriate. Moreover, for the sake of eradicating cases where they would be used for crime, they completely prohibited manufacturing and trading them. However, Mars did not comply with this. Just as in the anime, Ross Syllabus, or in this translation, Syllabus, is arriving on Mars. This time, he is with Interpol. He observes 2 mermaids in a tank at the airport who instruct him to meet Armitage in the East Lobby. During his walk to the East Lobby, he begins to light a cigarette, but is quickly informed that there is a smoking ban by 2 scantily clad women who he diagnoses as clearly illegal robots. He lights his cigarette anyways, pulls out a compass, and decides on the direction to head. We find out from Armitage that Ross is late. And quickly, the goofiness of this manga takes hold as she is spooked by a dog, and as she cowers in fear, the dog begins to hump her. She threatens the dog at gunpoint before taking off in a sprint. Ross finds himself in what looks like a maintenance tunnel just in time for Armitage to run past him, screaming, with the dog following soon after. As he diagnoses that he is in a shuttle hangar, he sees a very busty robot walk past him pushing a cart, but an arm falls out the side of it. Ross demands to inspect the cart, and as the robot woman turns to face him with a grin, he shoots her. This alerts Armitage, who, having had enough of the dog, yells for it to lie down and runs towards the sounds. Armitage has her pistol at the ready as she scopes out the area. This is what I was talking about. Ikigami has some of the most fantastic scenery detailing, especially with this futuristic industrial space. But I suppose he clearly enjoyed drawing porn more, or maybe it just paid the bills. Armitage finds the cart, and what's inside was not just a body, but a robot that has had its face stolen. She also finds Ross's suitcase. Soon she is alerted and she points her pistol, only to find that the dog has followed her. So she asks the dog to find the scent associated with the suitcase. Ross is further in the hangar near a shuttle preparing to launch while evacuation orders are being called out. As he stands off with the robot woman, he realizes he is out of ammo. He draws a knife, and from above the two combatants, a voice mocks him for his decision. Ross recognizes the man, Madnar, a man with long blonde hair and sunglasses who simply smiles and greets the detective. He gives a bit more taunting to Ross that a shuttle will be taking off soon, and if he doesn't hurry, he'll be trapped. Despite screaming for Madnar to come down and face him, the man only informs the robot below that her face is damaged, and bids farewell. The gate is closed, and the rocket starts ignition as the robot smiles while readying to shoot Ross. The blast of the engine throws Ross across the room while the robot remains planted and begins to cook, still intent on shooting him though. But Armitage and the dog make the scene first, breaking down a door. Armitage shoots the hostile robot, drags and rescues Ross's unconscious body, and even saves the dog as the rocket's flames rush into the bay, eventually being put out by the sprinklers. Ross regains consciousness as Armitage smothers him and introduces herself. He questions how he was saved, and when Armitage says it was her, he calls her a liar. That rocket that just took off, though, the story isn't done with that. A notice is given to the passengers by a cheerful female robot. The course is being changed to a vertical drop. Planned crash site, the Earth Federation building. Goodbye. Ross and Armitage watch as the shuttle plummets into the building, utterly destroying it. Chapter 2. Picking up shortly after the crash, Armitage, bright and cheerful, greets a sentient truck of sorts known as Torakichi, and the truck informs her that he is off to guard an important base. Shortly after, we're introduced to a much smaller robot, an orb on a pedestal called Little Chica. Little Chica informs Armitage that Ross is on a rampage. He's angry because he is being ordered to guard some base when his main focus is Radnar. He wants to arrest him, but the chief, a sexy blonde-haired woman in this adaptation, isn't taking him seriously. He arrested him once before, yes, but then Madnar escaped right after, and because of that, he's now on Mars. The order is given that if anyone finds him, they kill him. Ross isn't happy, but Armitage says she'll go too and restore his honor. Ross takes this as she's been assigned to keep an eye on him, but she denies that and he still accepts her help. As they travel by car with Armitage driving, Ross explains what happened a year and a half ago. He recovered what he thought was the corpse of Madnar, killed by an accidental detonation of plastic explosives he had been wearing, but hours later he revived himself and killed all of the officers in his way. Ross angrily puffs about being certain that Madnar isn't human, and predictably, this catches the attention of Armitage. He begins to inspect her, asking her if her skin is real, and she gives him a harsh look. He assumes that she was a burn victim, and asks if he hurt her feelings, but he can't help himself as he lights a cigarette, continuing on about the rumor that there are illegal robot models on Mars that have feelings and a sense of beauty, nicknamed thirds. At this, she stops the car and begins to strip, asking him if he wants to examine everything. He's extremely confused and apologizes, And then she breaks out a mask and whip before driving off and leaving the man stranded. As he yells after her, she radios an unknown recipient that, as she expected, Ross is trying to gather information about the thirds. She's headed to the old industrial area to meet Asakura's guard. And somehow, during her conversation, Ross has managed to catch up to the car on foot. In an industrial room where there are robot women in piles, standing in random places and even hanging from the ceiling, a man asks another what kind of girl he desires and begins to list off the types of resistances that he can provide. He doesn't wish to know what happens after, only an idiot would, but we see he is talking to Madnar, who calls him an idiot. This is our Asakura, a perverted Ben Franklin from the future in a chair. He demands to know how Madnar got in, to which he replies, he was born and raised here. It's stupid to ask. Asakura begins to plead for his life, stating that there are police officers and anti-terror robots outside, and they will... Madnar cuts him off. If he tries to sell him out, he'll kill him. But Asakura tells him that they are here of their own... He's cut off by Madnar again, leveling a gun at him. He shoots the robot girl behind the old man, and the man begins to plead once more, but Madnar has only one question. When does the war begin? Asakura continues to bawl and beg, but Madnar only repeats the question. When does the war begin? Asakura finally says that there can no longer be a war. The project failed. There cannot be a war, but Madnar only calls him a liar before shooting him. Armitage arrives at the scene, diving out with her gun and shouting freeze, but there's no one left except the truck Torakichi. Ross surveys the carnage for a moment, but Armitage takes off running, only to stop at the sight of Asakura's corpse hanging from a hook. Ross is stunned and asks who the man is, to which Armitage informs him that is the creator of the thirds. Suddenly, Armitage takes off running again. The police station is in danger. They have to go back, but it's too late. Madnar has already captured the police station and killed those within. Chapter 3. As Ross and Armitage arrive at the scene, they see the devastation and realize that they are too late. They look around, and once again Armitage takes off running, only to stop at the central control room, which is currently overrun by robot servants of Madnar who have hacked everything. If they are able to gain control of the central control computer, they gain access to all the systems, Martian society, the police station, and all sophisticated robots. Ross asks if this means Madnar has taken over the police station robots, which Armitage confirms, and then their fears are realized as armored units appear. Left with little choice, Armitage determines they must destroy the control room, and so they do. The police station is blown to bits, and Ross finds himself with his head between the thighs of Armitage. Nearby, little Chica, a little worse for wear, asks Armitage what she was thinking blowing up police headquarters, but she apologizes and insists that she didn't know destroying the control room would do that. As they walk through the city, Armitage openly takes the blame, but Ross tells her that everybody overdoes things once in a while. She says she couldn't protect the Federation building or Asakura, but Ross says humans can just be like that, and she yells at him that she's not human, stunning the man. She continues that she is a third, a next-generation independent humanoid robot bestowed with feelings and aesthetics. She allows a bit of sadness to creep into her eyes as she states that Madnar is the same. Ross continues to stare at her, and she seems to look up at him with hope in her eyes. Madnar seems to be lounging in a club somewhere, and he declares that disposing of Ross is his responsibility, before addressing his right-hand robot, Sakura. A second, with short blonde hair and darker skin, he instructs her to look around, and she simply replies, okay. He tells her that it may not look like it at first glance, but Mars has become full of humans. Though robots developed Mars, as soon as there was an atmosphere, the humans came, and if it keeps on this way, they will take over. However, he calls Sakura by name again, and tells her that Mars belongs to all of the robots, and he will eradicate the humans. Not only that, but he will give them all of the Earth, too. Back with Ross and Armitage, he's chasing after her, demanding more info. Also, where is she going? To which she explains, there is another third, a friend of hers named Ginga, and Ginga is not happy to see Armitage, greeting her with, go home. She says that she doesn't want to get involved. Go home. She's not taking anyone's side. From another room, some children begin to appear, asking if dinner is ready, and calling Ginga Auntie. She yells at them to shut up and asks if they've finished their Martian language studies. Ginga tells the pair not to mind them. They are children who immigrated illegally, and she's taking care of them. She continues on, the woes of humans needing food, water, money, to which Armitage says, so what? Ginga angrily replies that she's a doctor, not a detective, but Armitage insists that as thirds they are made to fight and pleads with her to help defeat Madnar. They are the only thirds left now, and if they don't defeat Madnar, he will kill all humans on Mars and many robots as well. But Ginga simply says she will run away to Earth if that happens, grudgingly admitting that she is not strong like Armitage, who is now having to be restrained by Ross as she calls Ginga a coward and curses at her. The two officers stand on a bridge outside the establishment they were with Ginga in, joined by little Chica. Armitage vents her frustrations as a strange woman walks by, and Ross takes notice but brushes it off and decides to ask what would happen if Ginga joined up with Madnar. Armitage practically cries while denying the possibility. She loves humans more than robots. She's a good robot, but Ross has his bias, demanding to know if Madnar is a good robot too. What are the thirds? What is their purpose? What does she mean they are the only three left? Were there more? Why were they destroyed? Why is she a detective, Ginga a doctor, and Madnar a terrorist? Little Chica tries to intervene, but Ross continues grabbing Armitage by the collar. It's not just the thirds. What are seconds doing all over Mars? They're all illegal. She stares sadly at him, stating that all robots are just built. It's not their fault. Little Chica pipes up, trying to get Armitage's attention, but she continues. 18 years ago, the humans of Mars decided to try to use robots to fight a war with Earth. The program is still alive, and Madnar is trying to set it in motion. Ross is dumbfounded, but there is no time. An explosion erupts. The building they were in with Ginga is destroyed, and a figure stands at the hole that was the entrance. Ross had a hunch about that woman, and he knows he messed up. The figure is Madnar, who proudly proclaims that Ginga is dead. Chapter 4. Armitage screams and runs at Madnar, and Ross tries to warn her, but all too late. He takes the shot at Sakura as Sakura shoots Armitage in the back. She stops in front of Madnar, and he gives her a "hey there" before she shoots him in the face. He regains his footing quickly and politely says, "Greetings, Armitage." The two thirds face off, and Ross can't believe that he is watching the both of them heal. Madnar calls for Sakura to shoot Ross, and she issues her typical "okay" from behind her victim before firing at him. But we find that Armitage has stepped in the way. She tells him to jump off, and she will shield him. He tries to protest, but she tells him to hurry. If she takes enough damage, she can die. Madnar seems to be okay with this and tells Ross to disappear as his business is with Armitage. Armitage tells him to hurry up, and Ross protests further as more seconds begin to close in with submachine gun fire. She calls him a coward before grabbing him and jumping down to the street below. She sets her hat on little Chica, who is already on the street, and as Ross comes to terms with what just happened, she walks away with little Chica left behind, trying to tell her not to fight. It seems that not all the police were destroyed by Madnar's siege on the station earlier. They are actively looking for Armitage but can't find her. The chief only knows that Armitage destroyed the central control room and disappeared. They don't know what she'll do next. There's a bigger problem, though. The seconds are going berserk. They only suspect that this is because of Madnar, though. Across the city, we begin seeing the effects of this. A little girl in the hospital being tormented by her robot nurses. Announcements going out to disable, remove the batteries, and disconnect the CPUs of all seconds. And as Ross searches for Armitage, the seconds are gunning down innocents in the street. As the remaining police debate what to do next, the chief heads out on her motorcycle just in time to encounter Ross, who is asking for backup for Armitage, but the chief says the top priority is meeting with Asakura. Of course, Ross questions this, but regardless, he hops on a motorcycle of his own and follows her as she explained that he copied his personality and that they need to go ask his hologram at the information management department for a way to stop the thirds. He asks her why she didn't tell him earlier, and she reveals that she knew he was a spy from Earth sent to gather information on the Thirds. He defends himself, saying that there's nothing wrong with investigating illegal robots. He's a detective. And she asks if he has found anything, to which he proudly exclaims that Armitage is the third. This the chief knew, so he mentions Madnar and Ginga, and we're led to believe that of course she knew about them as well, by Ross calling her out for her smile. Back with the main conflict, Little Chica calls for Armitage as the seconds continue to circle and kill indiscriminately with machine gun fire and smile. Back with the chief and Ross, they have arrived at the information management department, and the chief is shocked to find out that Ginga is dead. But why is this a big deal? Because she's a rampage trigger for Armitage. This of course worries Ross. Armitage has gone mad? They continue to walk into the building, and the chief confirms that this is a mode shift that will effectively turn Armitage berserk. Thirds have feelings, but they are the emotional equivalent to a 5 or 6-year-old human. Even more confused by this, Ross gives the chief a look, and she simply responds, "Thirds need us." Ross is still unclear, so the chief asks what he thinks of Armitage, to which he responds that she's an odd girl. It's his case, so he has to look for any sort of hint. But the chief says that Armitage tries to hide her identity with all her might, which makes her oddly reflect in the eyes of people. But Ginga was different. She didn't feel the need to hide anything, and she was the only person that Armitage trusted, the friend she could talk to about anything. That's why Madnar killed her, and why Armitage has now gone berserk. But Ross says he doesn't think she's gone berserk. She protected him. The chief receives a signal from a helmeted and masked figure at the desk, who tells her to use a specific interrogation room as surveillance is blocked in there, and if any of this leaks out, they'll all be in forced labor on Jupiter. Asakura's hologram appears, demanding money and claiming that it was deceived. He's a victim, but the chief has no patience for this and angrily demands not to hear it. But the hologram only asks for money and freedom. More infuriated, she informs the hologram that the program has been activated and they need to know how to stop it. The hologram becomes excited and with a smile says, "It can't be stopped. Has it finally begun? Has the war finally become a reality?" Ross is worried that this is a war between Earth and Mars, and he shouts as much, but the chief calmly states that it's really between Armitage and Madnar. The hologram only gleefully repeats, "Destroyed, destroyed, the fool will be destroyed." There are bodies in the street, and emergency services are showing up, surrounding a crater in front of a building which Armitage emerges from. They begin to yell for her attention, and bloodied in the face, she yells for them all to shut up. Little Chica tries to get her attention, but is also met with the same order. She can't hear his footsteps. Chapter 5. Standing amongst the wounded in emergency services, Armitage waits. Little Chica tries to alert her, but she yells that he's close. Suddenly, armored police units arrive and demand her surrender. The typical demands are issued. Drop your weapon. Don't resist. The onlookers inform us that it is the Special Duty Robot Squad, and Armitage is confused. She's done her job well. What has she done wrong? She tries to explain that Madnar is here and she can't protect them all, but the officers dismiss her as crazy. They swarm around her and restrain her, but past them, she sees him standing there, and then they see him too. Madnar demands that they not touch Armitage with their filthy hands. Armitage tells them to move and begins to rush Madnar, but they continue to restrain her. He demands again that they not touch her, and he begins to kill. Soon, seconds begin to swarm in and also kill the officers, and Madnar escapes the sight of Armitage and the confusion, as it seems that the seconds had been mixed in with the crowd. They begin to blast away, killing innocents. A child loses their mother. Radio calls for backups. Screams. Armitage tries to convince the people to let her lead them to safety, but they conclude that she's a robot and they believe that they can't trust her. There's nothing more she can do. With the chief and Ross, the hologram Asakura informs them that Armitage and Madnar are the heart of the program, the beginning and the end, the on and the off. Madnar signifies the beginning and Armitage the end. The two cannot exist at the same time and must never meet. Back with Armitage, she finds Madnar relaxing on a park bench and asks what he is doing. He only replies that it's gotten quiet. 2 seconds flank her as he continues. Now then, shall we begin our war? She aims her pistol at him and declares, let's end this. Immediately beset on all sides by seconds, she punches the head clean off of the closest one. She dodges another, plunging at her from above, and after it crashes into the ground, she grabs a street lamp and decapitates it. Another emerges from a doorway to shoot at her, but she smashes the back of its skull into a wall. One more tries to sneak up on her from the shadows, but it's quickly met with a pistol in the mouth, which makes a large hole in the head. None of this seems to faze Madnar, whose only reaction is, ooh, scary. And his faithful right hand Sakura stands at his side with a smile. Our conversation with the hologram resumes once more. Of course, if the on and off switches are broken, the system will not work. They are the switches. Ross demands answers. Who pushes that switch? Is it Asakura? He replies that they do it by themselves. Ross is only losing his temper further, but Asakura tells him to calm down, as the system only activates if the conditions are met, and Armitage will win. The war will end in pre-established harmony, but he does not know when that will occur. Ask Armitage. She is the one who will decide. This is a non-human war program. The Thirds will carry out the operation, and humans are not necessary. Chief now loses her temper. There has to be a way to suspend Asakura's dolls. Everything that is happening is due to his incompetence. Ross asks if that is why Asakura gave the Thirds personalities. Most Thirds don't like humans at all, but Asakura continues undeterred. So to speak, Madnar is the king of destruction. The only things he enjoys are victory and destruction. By contrast, Armitage is a savior, a goddess who fights against destruction for the sake of peace. That is entirely their will. Orders are not necessary. Their bodies heal and repair themselves, even if they are broken. So, what will happen? To the Thirds, you mean? Well, the Fool will be destroyed. Finally fully losing it, the Chief rips the cables from the hologram projector, asking what it all means. Are they to help Armitage? Ross begins to berate that it's only because they had this dependence on robots, but he's interrupted by another officer. The anti-terror robots are on the move. One of the commanders informs via radio that they have removed the armor and brain of one, so it can't walk independently, but they can use the cannon manually. They are going to load it onto a transport helicopter and attack from the sky. The Chief approves and says they will leave at once. They are going to destroy the Thirds. Ross asks if this means Armitage too, and she says of course. Mars cannot tolerate the robots doing as they wish. Ross protests that she's not crazy, but the Chief says she's still only a robot. The only reason she wants to protect humans is because it is written into her. She may not have gone crazy, but she is no longer a detective. She is a soldier, and whenever she comes into contact with Madnar, destruction unfolds. Ross doesn't approve and takes off on a motorcycle. Armitage is a friend, and he can't let her be destroyed. Soon he slides to a stop as he sees little Chica in the road wearing Armitage's hat. With our battle, Armitage is bloodied and angry. She demands Madnar stand, but he monologues. In his brain, it is written to kill her, and in her brain, it is written to kill him. It's not fair that she is special. If he kills her, the war would end, but it would disappear. The shallow cunning of humans. Armitage has had enough. She asks if he has said everything he wanted, but he continues. Even though it is written that he must kill her, making her a slave is also written. The seconds spring sharp metallic appendages from their bodies. Power hackers. As they pierce Armitage all over, she screams. Madnar apologizes. Her ego must disappear. Then she can witness him destroy the monkeys and become the supreme ruler of the universe. Volume 2. Chapter 6. Ross races to find Armitage with little Chica in tow. He looks for the helicopter, and when he spots it, he concludes that he must hurry. Little Chica instructs him on a shortcut, and then we catch up with Armitage. In pain and pinned down by the power hackers in a dried concrete ravine, Madnar taunts her and monologues further as we are shown that she has been impaled even through her eye. Calling himself the #1 Third, her older brother. But she's not done yet. She grabs him by the collar and says, "So what?" At that moment, the helicopter arrives. Those on board radio the situation to the chief, and she tells them to fire. They try to protest because of Armitage, but she orders them to blow her away with Madnar. Armitage realizes that they intend to kill her as well, but at that moment, Ross comes racing up on his bike, snatching her up right before the cannon blasts the area, and they narrowly escape the blast to the surprise of all observing. It appears Madnar has survived, though. They prepare to fire once more as Madnar rages in the flames while regenerating. The next shot fires directly into Madnar's back and out his chest. Armitage and Ross watch the explosion from a safe distance, and Armitage seems ambivalent. Ross says that they should go. If they get careless, they could end up dead. Where to? His place, he says with a smile. The police survey the area, one claiming they are sure Madnar is dead, but they can't locate the body. It strikes the chief that that's what Ross was up to. He wanted a body, a third's body, the hardware having the advanced healing and repair mechanisms. The people of Earth could use this to further explore space. Mars developed and progressed well, but not Venus or Jupiter, so logically, deeper in space is the next step. But they don't have the technology yet. Because Earth feared Mars, talented people slowly flowed onto it, but this led to Earth becoming less important. But now, there is a price. Planetary development is population control. Earth takes those that they can't feed, and they throw them on sterile planets and tell them to become self-reliant. So, anyone with a brain now flees to Mars. Awaiting on a cliffside are Earth officials. It seems they don't fully trust Ross, though, as he arrives. Guards aim at him. Ross is upset by this, and they tell him he can step down, but he asks where the boss is. Armitage looks at him with concern and asks what they plan to do with her. He tells her not to worry, they'll take good care of her. But she's hurt. She asks why. Was she nothing but a living third sample to him? Was she just another job? This strikes Ross deep. He tries to justify it. It's for her own safety. She'll be disposed of as some rampaging robot if she stays here. She gives a simple, "I'm fine." He tries to tell her to think. It's the best way. Earth needs her. Earth is safer. She tells him, really, she's fine. But he tries to convince her further. She tells him again, she's fine. He pleads with her more, but her demeanor changes to suddenly serious. Madnar has awoken. In the crater left by the cannon, the men who are surveying the area for his body take a break for lunch, but suddenly, two are looking at one, who questions, what are they looking at? Madnar's head erupts from the ground, visibly irritated. Chapter 7. Armitage steals the motorcycle and takes off as the Earth soldiers scramble and Ross is momentarily stunned. The Earth forces send hover speed bikes after her, and Ross himself knocks a soldier off of a hover speeder with a kick to commandeer it and leave. But not before little Chica asks to come along, to which Ross says, fine, hop on and let's go, and they speed off. There is a pursuing pair of Earth soldiers on a hover speeder, trying to hit Armitage with the mounted minigun, but they miss. They bicker between each other, and this leads them to nearly crashing into a factory smokestack, and they lose sight of her. As she makes it back into the city, Ross is close and still behind her, pleading with her to come back to Earth. No time for that, though. Seconds have blockaded ahead, and the pair are met with machine gun fire. Armitage pulls a sudden maneuver, and Ross is too slow to react and ends up destroying his speeder, which we can also assume destroyed the attacking seconds. Armitage informs him once again that Madnar has awoken. The seconds have blockaded the downtown area, and Ross correctly concludes that the war program has restarted. Armitage says it's her turn now, but Ross stands in front of her on her bike. He asks where she plans on going, to which she answers, to kill Madnar. But he tells her to stop acting like a spoiled child, which confuses her. He says, you're a detective, aren't you? But she replies that she is currently a soldier, and he reiterates that's just being a spoiled child. If she's a soldier, he's not a detective either, so what is she? According to the program, she is meant to faithfully carry out her duty, but he interrupts that means she is nothing but a puppet, and again, she is stunned by his words. He lights a cigarette as he tells her that she is a man-made, moving puppet according to the program, meant to carry out orders, stop the robots, protect the humans. She contemplates his words, and he continues, don't thirds want friends. She's a third, the same as Madnar, and she begins to protest, asking what he's trying to say, and he responds that she should persuade Madnar, ask him to stop the war. He won't listen to a human, but Ross knows that Madnar will listen to her. She doesn't buy it, but he insists. She says she can't. It's not written in the program, but Ross says that she won't know if she doesn't try. Back with the Earth forces, they now have their hands on Asakura. They found the copy, and in that case, they believe they no longer need a third sample. But the leader of the group, an old man known as the Superintendent, disagrees. It's not enough. His mind wasn't the only important thing. He was a craftsman. Without his limbs, he's useless. All of the Earth's engineers have never actually seen a third, and they would be unreliable without a sample. The superintendent's assistant, the major, tries to retort, and the old man asks what it is. With Madnar having regenerated himself, even if they get Armitage to Earth, Madnar won't remain silent. They can't take her to Earth. Madnar's orders are to destroy humans. But he says that he has already thought of something in case of an emergency like that. Madnar has his seconds again, and on the ground close to them is the chief and her remaining officers. They're going to use the helicopter again, except the Earth forces have seized it. The chief gets on the phone with the superintendent, and he calmly states that he is now acting as the Martian police chief to lead the Joint Detective Bureau. He commands the chief to cancel all activities in regards to the thirds. They are important assets for the future of mankind, and their destruction will not be tolerated. The chief rages. Are they trying to get them killed? To which the superintendent replies, some sacrifices must be made. I pray for the safety of you all. With that, the superintendent gives the order to withdraw. They are leaving everything to the people of Mars. Ross and Armitage arrive at the scene of the carnage on their motorcycle, and Madnar politely greets them. Armitage yells and screams, and Ross tries to hold her back as she continues. He tries to tell her that if she rampages any further, Earth will launch a nuclear attack from orbit. She stops, scared by this revelation. Ross continues. The Earth is afraid that the War of the Thirds will stretch to it, and even if she kills Madnar, he will regenerate. She must stop him without killing him. Madnar is confused by this whole conversation, so Ross yells it at him in simple terms. Armitage is going to try to persuade him. He asks what she is playing at, and she declares as much herself. She yells at him to prepare himself, but Ross tells her it needs to be a little softer. There's a short bicker, but it concludes with, everyone is a beginner at first. During the conversation between Ross and Armitage, Madnar points a gun at Ross and asks for his attention. Following with, you've been teaching weird things to Armitage, haven't you? She rushes at him, and a shot rings out. Chapter 8. Madnar has shot Ross, and Armitage is stunned. Ross is stunned. Little Chica is there. Madnar prepares to shoot again, but Armitage rushes him and shoves her fingers into his eyes. Madnar knocks her away, but this only results in her pulling his eyes out. While he recovers, Armitage goes to Ross. Madnar demands she give his eyes back, and as Armitage begins to respond in anger, even while dying, Ross tells her to persuade him. He yells at her to do such, but she says it's impossible. She can't. She's nothing but a professional killer. But Ross says that's just the program. Unfortunately, this conversation is interrupted by the arrival of armored soldiers, but they are quickly flanked by Sakura and an army of seconds. Still blind, Madnar gives the command to kill. While the firefight is going on, Armitage takes Madnar by the hand and leads him away, leaving Ross behind. It seems not all of the soldiers are occupied, though, as some go to follow, and the chief arrives. Ross demands to know why they are shooting at her, why they are chasing her. If they take the time to think it over, they will stop. Following the soldiers and Armitage is Little Chica, still wearing Armitage's hat. The soldiers blast their way through the buildings without regard in their pursuit of Madnar. High above Mars, on a surveillance satellite manned by Earth Commonwealth, the superintendent is approached by the major and informed that 90% of all seconds on Mars in all Martian urban areas are under Madnar's control. Mars is on the verge of collapse. His response? Prepare to attack. Back on Mars, as Ross is being loaded into an ambulance, he screams at the chief that if the program continues like this, Earth will launch a nuclear attack from orbit. The chief shoots him an angry gaze, but he exclaims to leave it to Armitage. He's gambling on her. They have to evacuate the citizens right now. Anywhere will do, but she doesn't buy it. He explains that Mars is a den of threatening science and technology scholars. The hardliner group of the Commonwealth Parliament are eager to bury it. All the while, a nurse is screaming at him to shut up because he is bleeding out. Soldiers are informing the chief that the area is lost. There are more seconds than humans now. Ross screams that the thirds are setting the table, but she retorts that if their feelings die, the thirds die too. She clarifies, yelling that if their feelings die, then they are unable to regenerate. They fall and die. Ross recites this with confusion. The chief says that she doesn't understand what it means, but at any rate, ordinary people can do nothing but try to destroy them. Though Ross has been loaded onto an ambulance, he stands up from the gurney despite the nurses trying to hold him back, contemplating this revelation of the third's possible death. The chief brings up his words from earlier. This all happened because you depended on robots too much. Is that what he wants to say? She grabs him by the shirt and pulls him out of the ambulance and begins to yell once more. He's the same as them. Earth let the poor develop new lands while they themselves did nothing. Earth sent a spy like him, and the conclusion is nuclear war. Do they not consider the Martians human? She continues, but Ross only repeats the line about the death of the thirds. And as the chief demands a response, he collapses. His last words are, "What a joke." Madnar calls out for Armitage, and as she appears, he says she's gotten quiet. His eyes have grown back, and he has a smile. She only demands that he apologize. This obviously confuses him, and Sakura watches from behind with the same look as always. Armitage says that if he apologizes, she'll forgive him. To her dismay, he bursts into laughter. She demands to know what's so funny, and he asks her if she's retarded. To which she yells, she's not. She didn't want to do this, but Ross, he taunts her. This is the conclusion the brain she was given came to. What will she do? But she tells him to shut up. She may be dumber than a human, but not so stupid as to do what she's told. He continues to chuckle a bit while telling her to calm down, but she yells at him that she has a right to end the program, so apologize. But he simply responds, "Kill me." As long as his feelings continue, he will regenerate. And long before he destroys Mars and Earth, the monkeys of those worlds will destroy everything. She still doesn't want to kill him, and asks if he wants to be killed by her like this, and he responds that isn't what he's done unforgivable. She begins to yell again, but he tells her to wait a moment, and points to his head. There it is written that he must kill her. She asks what he intends to do, and he points a pistol at his temple. Erase himself. Chapter 9. Onlookers have gathered to the scene. Madnar towers above Armitage with the gun still pressed to his temple. She pleads with him that thirds shouldn't do something like that, but he declares that from this point he will be free. She tells him it's too much, and he cocks the hammer while declaring to become free, he must kill himself. Armitage begs him not to do it. A third's emotions are what allow them to live and come back. If he does that, his emotions will be destroyed too. He smiles, telling her to just watch because he will destroy everything. She asks him one last time to stop, and he pulls the trigger. His body collapses in front of her, and all of the police onlookers cannot believe that he actually did it. But then, arcs of electricity begin to emit from his body, and soon they realize he's not dead. Armitage stands over his body, unamused as he begins to rise once more. Their eyes meet, and he greets her with a, "Hey there," but she just calls him an idiot. He makes a manic face while questioning being called an idiot, and the police are given the order to evacuate. In his rage, Madnar strikes Armitage, telling her that the idiot is her, and they struggle. But little Chica says meekly from the floor, "Don't fight." They stop and look at little Chica, who says, "Good kids, now, try to get along, okay?" Madnar does not take kindly to this and turns his attention to little Chica. Armitage tries to get his attention again and tells him if he shoots little Chica, she will never forgive him. And he only says, "Good." And then, to her horror, he does in fact shoot little Chica, completely destroying the little robot, and the tiny robot lets out last dying words, only introducing itself one last time. This understandably enrages Armitage far beyond any point we have seen. The police panic. The persuasion has failed. Evacuate. The chief screams over the radio, demanding to know what's going on. Ross, who isn't dead somehow, says it's begun. The nuclear strike has begun. Announcements go out that the defense system partitions are being closed, and Madnar is back in full form. He shoots Armitage, who falls back through a window, and yells at her to stay out, but she's not done. This only further enrages Madnar, but something is wrong. His vision starts to glitch, and Armitage knows. She sadly informs him that his body has begun to die. If only he had listened, but instead, he tells her that she will die first. She tries to tell him to calm down, but like a child, he screams, "Don't tell me what to do." But she tries to tell him that she's already won. Just surrender. If he surrenders, he will survive. However, he only tells her that it is his fate to die. She grabs him and tells him that if he gives up, he really will die. She tries every way she can to reason with him. End the program. Let her win. Stop the seconds. But he says no. If he stops, life has no meaning. But she tells him he's wrong. He could study from now on. Because he is a third too. They have good brains. She's a detective. It's okay to have hope. But he just says, it's okay. She cries, telling him that if he stops doing bad things, he can make friends. He merely gives her a sincere smile and says, it really is okay. She stands stunned, and then asks him not to die before he collapses to his knees, and she screams his name as he is finally gone. Out in the streets, the seconds have shut down. It's over. The program has ended. To the dismay of the chief, the Earth forces land on the planet. Someone calls for the superintendent. It's Armitage. She briskly walks through the crowd, including the Earth soldiers, before anyone can stop her, and fires a shot at the old man. The bullet grazes his cheek. Armitage says she has a question. It's about the nuclear strike. Did he carry it out? The stoic facade of the superintendent crumbles as he begs for her not to shoot. There was no nuclear strike. They stopped it. She asks why. He doesn't respond, so she says she could kill them all now. It's not too late for them to still do it. The old man shouts that Armitage said before she can't lay a finger on human beings, but she retorts that they were planning on killing all the thirds with the nuclear strike. If they want people to die, she can make it happen here. But he continues to plead. She tells him that it's written in her mind to protect the humans of Mars. So go home. If he tries anything like that again, she won't let him off. She is the guardian of Mars. Later, at the airport, Ross is heading home as per his orders. Also, little Chica has been repaired. Armitage asks if he will come again, but he only responds that the people of Earth will come again. This brings about a not-so-happy look to her. Then Ross remembers something. He says he knows it's a bit weird, but he wanted to give her something. It's a picture of Madnar, and it seems to mean a lot to her. With a smile, he says to give a call if she ever needs anything. She says thank you, and Ross's last words as he leaves are, "Those clothes suit you." There are 2 extra chapters, but these are simply a prelude by Ikigami and an afterstory written and illustrated by Otana. In the prelude, it is the story of Madnar's creation and Sakura being assigned to him. He didn't like Sakura at first, and she only responds with affirmatives to whatever Madnar says while following him everywhere. This annoys him at first, but he eventually grows to like having her around, before he is eventually launched to Earth in a pod which crashes into the ocean, where he is to wait for his order to start the war program. But the order doesn't come. 18 years later, his pod corrodes to the point it collapses, and he awakes, escapes, and begins terrorizing the Earth before making his way back to Mars. In the afterstory, Armitage dreams that she and Madnar live together and are actually friends, but it turns into a nightmare and she wakes up. Eventually, Sakura finds her and starts killing her. She punches through Armitage's stomach, ripping it open. She shoots her with guns that emerge from the center of her body, and with a rocket launcher, just brutal stuff, before eventually Armitage point blank shoots her in the mouth, and that's where it ends. Bye.